When you walk into a doctor's office with some mystery illness, the most critical moment actually isn't the treatment.
Right. It's the diagnosis.
Exactly. I mean, if a doctor looks at your symptoms and decides you have a bacterial infection, they give you antibiotics. But if the reality is that you're suffering from, like, a viral infection, those antibiotics aren't just going to be useless.
They could actually make things worse.
Yeah, they could fundamentally compromise your immune system because everything, absolutely everything, hinges on getting that root problem right from the very first moment.
Which means if that foundational premise is wrong, the whole chain of logic, the entire treatment plan, is just going to lead you systematically off a cliff.
Welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you're joining us today because we are putting on our most rigorous analytical thinking caps. We're looking at a highly provocative and deeply urgent 2023 essay by Joseph Bay. It's titled, Why Christians Must Reject Leftism.
It is definitely a heavy one.
It is. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack Bay's core thesis. He is arguing that leftism isn't just, a collection of political policy preferences or tax strategies. He posits that it's a comprehensive rival worldview that is fundamentally incompatible with Christian doctrine. And he actually takes it a step further.
He really does.
Yeah, he argues it is as inherently evil as Satanism. Because Bay starts building his argument right at that diagnostic level we just talked about.
The doctor analogy.
Yeah, the doctor analogy. He says every comprehensive worldview has to answer two fundamental questions. What is the world's greatest problem? And what is the ultimate solution?
And, under Bay's reading of the Christian worldview, the core problem afflicting humanity is human sin, specifically original sin and the fallen nature of mankind.
Right.
Consequently, the solution is spiritual redemption through the cross and resurrection of Jesus. So the disease is an internal corruption, and the cure is a spiritual transformation.
But then Bay sets up this really sharp contrast by looking at how leftism answers those exact same questions. He asserts that leftism identifies the world's greatest evil not as internal sin, but as external inequality.
That's a massive pivot.
It is, because leftist ideology, according to Bay, fundamentally assumes humanity is inherently good. So it logically can't blame human nature for suffering.
So it'd have to look outside.
Exactly. Any suffering we see must have an external cause. It has to be the result of structural oppression or corrupt institutions.
And the implications of that diagnostic difference are just massive. Going back to your medical analogy, the Christian doctor says the patient is sick from the inside and needs a heart transplant. But the leftist doctor says the patient is perfectly healthy by nature, but they're being actively poisoned by an unequal environment.
Oh, yeah.
And if inequality is the primary disease, well, the treatment can't be spiritual redemption. The only logical solution is a political revolution. You have to overturn those external structures and build a society completely free from material distinction.
And I noticed in the essay that Bay argues chasing that specific utopia requires a really destructive genesis. Like, to truly eliminate inequality, he says you have to systematically dismantle the very institutions that naturally produce it.
Yeah, he points to three specific pillars that have to go. First is the family unit, because, parents will always inherently favor their own children, right?
Right, which creates an unequal distribution of resources.
Exactly. Second is religion, because it divides society into different belief systems. And third is private property, because that's the root of material distinction. So in Bay's view, this isn't about tweaking marginal tax rates. It's an ambitious project to dismantle the foundational structures of society.
That sets up the philosophical clash so perfectly. So how exactly does Bay use scripture to defend private property and inequality? Because he runs this leftist argument straight into a biblical wall using the Ten Commandments.
He focuses really heavily on the eighth commandment. You shall not steal. And Bay provides some vital historical context here.
Oh, about the ancient Near East.
Right. In that era, tribal collectivism and communal ownership were basically the default modes of survival. So for God to issue a divine decree stating you shall not steal, Bay argues that was a radical countercultural establishment of private property rights.
That makes sense. It validates individual ownership right from the start.
Exactly, cutting directly against the idea that the collective owns everything.
And he carries that logic right into the 10th commandment, too. The one about not coveting your neighbor's house or belongings. Bay makes a fascinating maneuver here. He basically reframes the entire modern political focus on wealth redistribution as covetousness.
Yeah, just covetousness that's been systematized into a political program.
Right. He uses the phrase envy with an ideology.
That phrase really captures the core of his critique. And then to further cement his argument that material inequality isn't unbiblical, he turns to the parable of the talents.
Oh, this part was wild.
Yeah, so in the New Testament, a master gives his servants different amounts of money or talents. The servants who multiply their resources get rewarded. But Bay highlights this crucial detail. In the kingdom of heaven, as described in that parable, material and authoritative distinctions aren't erased.
They're actually magnified.
Yes, the servant who doubled his 10 talents isn't given equal standing with the others. He is explicitly given authority over 10 cities.
See, that was a huge theological curveball for me, because the assumption is usually that heaven is the ultimate equalizer. But Bay points out that the only place in all of Scripture where every single distinction vanishes, where there is total, absolute equality, is hell.
Yeah, hell and the lake of fire.
Right, and he uses that to argue that the leftist vision of a totally equal, classless utopia actually looks more like the biblical description of hell than heaven.
It's a staggering claim, and he applies a similar rigorous critique to the modern concept of social justice, relying on Leviticus 19.
Okay, remind me about that passage.
That specific passage commands judges to administer justice without partiality. Crucially, it explicitly commands them not to show partiality even to the poor.
Which feels incredibly counterintuitive to modern sensibilities. I mean, the cultural instinct today is that true justice requires actively tilting the scales to favor the marginalized, to make up for historical imbalances.
But Bay argues that instinct fundamentally violates the biblical definition of the rule of law. According to Leviticus 19, justice has to be entirely blind. So when ideologies introduce concepts like social justice or environmental justice, Bay argues they aren't achieving equity.
They're introducing tribal partiality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They are prioritizing group identity over impartial truth, which corrupts the judicial system.
So if Bay's analysis is correct, that this worldview directly contradicts biblical teachings on property and justice, it kind of begs the question, right? Why is it so magnetically appealing to so many people, including millions of modern churchgoers?
Right.
Bay transitions from theology to human psychology to explain this, and he uses this fascinating analogy of a healthy family dynamic.
This is central to his view of human vulnerability. Think about the first decade of a child's life. In a functional home, parents possess absolute authority, and they use it to provide for their children's needs equally.
A child gets the same food, the same shelter as their siblings, regardless of what they produce.
Exactly. So for the first formative years of a person's existence, that environment, benevolent authority providing perfect equality is literally the only paradigm they know.
And the psychological shock happens when that child eventually steps out of the family unit and into the real world.
Yep.
Suddenly, they hit a society defined by extreme inequality, differing capabilities, and unequal outcomes. And because their baseline for how the world should work was forged in that childhood paradigm, the inequality of the real world feels deeply unnatural.
What's fascinating here is that Bay posits people subconsciously extrapolate that childhood expectation onto broader society. They feel betrayed, so they look for a massive societal parent to restore that lost equilibrium.
But society isn't a family.
Right, and the government isn't a benevolent father. But individuals who never psychologically outgrow that search for an all-providing authority end up placing those demands on the state.
He labels this phenomenon government salvationism.
Yes. He defines it as an idolatrous belief. It's the conviction that the state can and morally must provide the ultimate security and provision that biblical Christianity argues only God can truly give.
And he contrasts this with Romans 13, right?
Exactly. He argues Scripture defines the government's role very narrowly. It exists solely to maintain public order, punish lawbreakers, provide basic defense. Expecting the government to redistribute wealth is, in his framework, a massive overreach that borders on state worship.
Okay, so that psychological vulnerability explains the demand side of things, but Bay also maps out the supply side. He traces a very specific historical lineage to explain how intellectuals basically weaponize that human desire for a societal parent.
Yeah, he traces a pipeline starting with classical Marxism. Marx divided humanity along a single economic axis, the bourgeoisie oppressing the proletariat.
The expectation was a global workers' uprising.
Right. But when the Russian Revolution failed to spark a worldwide revolt, Marxist intellectuals realized their single-axis theory wasn't enough.
Yeah.
So they regrouped in Frankfurt, Germany in the 1930s.
The Frankfurt School.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they developed what Bay considers a far more insidious framework, critical theory.
To explain how critical theory functions, we have to look at how it expanded that oppressor versus oppressed dynamic. It didn't just abandon the economic struggle, it multiplied the axes of oppression.
Race, gender, sexual orientation, religious background.
Yeah, it created a matrix where every single human interaction is viewed purely through power dynamics.
And the devastating result of this, according to Bay, is the systematic erasure of the imago Dei. That's the foundational biblical concept that every individual is uniquely made in the image of God.
Right, possessing innate value and moral agency.
But under critical theory, individual uniqueness gets stripped away. People are reduced entirely to their intersectional group identities. You're just an avatar of systemic privilege or systemic victimhood.
Bay notes that constructing this theory in an academic setting in the 1930s is one thing, but getting it to dominate modern culture required a delivery mechanism. And he points to the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci.
The war of position.
Right. Gramsci realized violent revolutions often fail in complex Western societies, so he proposed a strategy of extreme patience. A slow, methodical infiltration of a society's cultural and educational institutions.
Schools, media, the entertainment industry.
Even seminaries. You slowly reshape the vocabulary of a culture until the revolutionary worldview just feels like common sense.
It's a long game.
It is. Now, I followed his logic through the 1930s in Gramsci, but later in the essay, here's where it gets really interesting. He takes what feels like a massive historical leap.
Oh, to the ancient world.
Yes, he suddenly connects modern progressive politics to ancient Gnosticism and ultimately concludes that leftism is a form of Satanism. I mean, that sounds like pure hyperbole meant to shock the reader. How does he justify that jump?
Well, he unpacks this philosopher named Eric Voegelin to build that bridge.
Yeah.
To understand it, we have to look at ancient Gnostic belief. The Gnostics believed the physical, material world was inherently corrupt and evil. They believed the God of the Old Testament, the Creator, was actually an inferior, malevolent deity they called the demiurge. And they thought this demiurge trapped pure spiritual sparks inside physical bodies.
Wow.
So for a Gnostic, true enlightenment required rebelling against the physical creation. They even revered the serpent in the Garden of Eden as a liberator who offered secret knowledge.
Meaning they viewed the fundamental physical distinctions of creation, like the boundary between humanity and nature or male and female, as oppressive constructs designed by an evil creator.
That's precisely the connection Bay is making. The Gnostics exalted the blurring of boundaries. They strived for an androgynous ideal. So Bay argues that the modern radical transgender movement isn't a novel civil rights development. He says it's ancient Gnosticism resurrected for the 21st century.
A theological rebellion against the physical reality of God's design.
Exactly. And he applies that same Gnostic framework to the extreme fringes of the climate movement, too.
Yeah, he's not talking about basic environmental stewardship here. He calls it the climate cult.
Right. A movement characterized by apocalyptic prophecy, intense human guilt over carbon emissions, and a desire to radically reorganize global society.
And all of these movements, Bay argues, share the same ultimate goal. He uses a very technical term he borrows from Voegelin, immanentizing the eschaton. Let's break that phrase down because it carries the weight of his entire thesis. What does that mean?
Well, the eschaton refers to the end times, the final, perfect kingdom of heaven promised in Scripture. To immanentize it means trying to drag that divine future perfection into current human history by force.
Engineering heaven on earth ourselves.
Exactly. Through absolute political control, technological mastery, tearing down old systems, Bay links this directly back to the serpent's original temptation. You will be like God. That arrogant pursuit of self-divinity is why he ultimately labels the ideology a sophisticated iteration of Satanism.
Which brings his whole historical critique crashing directly into the present-day church. Because Bay issues a really severe warning to modern Christians who try to navigate a middle path between these two worldviews. He goes hard after centrist Christians.
His critique of centrism is uncompromising. He argues that trying to synthesize leftist ideology with Christian theology is an exercise in profound contradiction. From his perspective, claiming to be a centrist is as logically incoherent as stating, I believe in both God and Satan.
Wow.
Yeah.
Ooh.
He's particularly critical of moderate theologians who try to harmonize the two by redefining the crucifixion. He argues they distort the gospel by reframing Jesus' death primarily as a political act against Roman injustice.
But Bay counters that by pointing to Matthew 1.21. He will save his people from their sins. The mandate wasn't liberation from poverty or systemic oppression, it was salvation from internal sin.
And to vividly illustrate that difference, Bay brings up the historical example of Simon the Zealot.
Simon is such a compelling case study for this argument. Before joining Jesus' inner circle, Simon literally belonged to a violent political faction dedicated to the revolutionary overthrow of the Roman occupation.
He was looking for a political messiah.
Exactly. But as Bay points out, after witnessing the resurrection, Simon entirely abandoned his revolutionary political agenda.
He didn't try to merge his zealot politics with his new faith.
No, he gave his life entirely to preaching a spiritual gospel. Bay asks a piercing question here. If the true purpose of Jesus' ministry was to eradicate structural inequality, why did Simon the Zealot drop his political revolution the moment he finally understood who Jesus was?
Right. And the implication is that modern Christians who try to turn Jesus into a mascot for progressive policies are falling into the exact same trap Simon was in before his conversion.
Which leads Bay to use a remarkably harsh term for well-meaning churchgoers who adopt this rhetoric today. He calls them useful idiots.
It is a jarring term. It originally came from Stalinist Marxism, actually. It described naive people in Western democracies who enthusiastically advanced Soviet propaganda without understanding the brutal ultimate goals of the regime.
And Bay is saying modern churches are filled with them.
Yes, believers who blindly parrot the vocabulary of social justice and systemic oppression because the words sound inherently compassionate. They're entirely unaware they're importing an ideological Trojan horse that ultimately ceased to dismantle the biblical worldview.
So, to synthesize this huge deep dive, Joseph Bay is arguing that leftist political ideology and Christian theology are mutually exclusive rival worldviews. Leftism diagnoses the problem as inequality, assumes human innocence, and chases a political utopia. Christianity diagnoses the problem as human sin, recognizes our flawed nature, and offers spiritual redemption.
And Bay points to the American Revolution of 1776 as a successful, non-utopian experiment in ordered liberty. The founders knew human nature was flawed, so they didn't try to build heaven on earth. They built a system of checks and balances to mitigate sin, rather than trying to violently eradicate imperfection.
So his ultimate directive to you, the listener, is a call to stand firm, rigorously champion personal moral responsibility, resist government overreach, and remember that true hope can't be legislated. It's found only in the promise of Christ's return, as described in Revelation 21.5.
But, as we wrap up, his analysis leaves us with a deeply challenging paradox to ponder.
What's that?
Well, if Bay is entirely correct that the government has no mandate to cure material inequality, and the church's focus must remain strictly on spiritual salvation from sin, who is ultimately left to bridge the terrifying gap for the genuinely destitute in the here and now?
That is a tough question.
Right. And if society allows that gaping void of human suffering to remain unaddressed, doesn't that vacuum inherently invite the exact kind of desperate government salvationism Bay is warning us to avoid?
Oh, wow. It is the ultimate diagnostic dilemma. I mean, if the true disease is sin, but the glaring symptom of crushing poverty is ignored, the patient might eventually get desperate enough to beg for the wrong cure all over again. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense intellectual exploration today.
It's been quite a journey.
Definitely. Keep questioning the diagnoses you are handed, keep searching for the root causes beneath the surface, and keep learning. We will catch you on the next deep dive.